Derek Stone was walking through the busy streets of the city on a typical Monday morning. Sunlight was just beginning to filter through the tall buildings, casting long shadows on the sidewalks filled with hurried people. The atmosphere was filled with the sound of car horns, sirens in the distance, and the bustle of people starting their day. In the crowd, Derek moved at a leisurely pace, noted for his confident air and calm presence. Derek, in his early 30s, wore an elegant dark suit, carefully ironed, and his well-polished shoes echoed on the pavement. He had just left his usual breakfast at a cozy little restaurant around the corner, where the staff knew him well. He had had his usual bowl of scrambled eggs, turkey bacon, and a serving of fresh fruit. As he approached his car, a black sedan with modern lines, his phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from his mother reminding him of the plans for dinner that night, something he always did to make sure he didn't forget. As he responded with a smile, 2 officers approached. Derek noticed them immediately, but he didn't worry. I was used to seeing new faces of the police patrolling the area. However, the way they were watching him with a fixed and serious gaze gave him a bad feeling. "Excuse me, sir," called the first mate, whose name on the badge said Carter. The other, Roberts, stood a few steps behind with one hand resting on his belt. Derek put his phone away and turned to them, showing a neutral expression. "Good morning, officers," he replied in a firm but polite voice. "Can you show us identification?" asked Carter, his tone dry and almost demanding. There was no greeting or explanation as to why they were approaching him, which set off an alert in Derek's mind. "Can I ask why?" replied Derek, trying to stay in control of the situation without openly challenging them. I knew I had done nothing wrong and there was no reason for this interaction. "Just show us your ID. It's a simple request," Carter replied, his gaze fixed and cold. Derek slowly agreed, pulling his wallet out of the inside pocket of his jacket. "Sure, but I'd like to know why they're asking me for it," he said as he handed them his driver's license. Roberts, the other officer, shifted subtly, as if he were preparing for something. Derek felt his gut telling him to stay calm and measure every word. Carter reviewed the document with an imperturbable expression. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" asked Carter in an accusatory tone. Derek frowned slightly, confused. "I just go to my car to go to work," he replied. "Where was he before?" Carter insisted, ignoring Derek's question. At the corner restaurant, having breakfast, Derek replied, maintaining his neutral tone. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer returned the ID, but his gaze did not change. "We have received reports of suspicious activity in the area. You match the description of the person we are looking for." Derek felt a twinge of frustration in his stomach. I knew what was going on. It was a familiar story to him, a well-dressed black man in an affluent neighborhood being seen as a suspect. "I understand," he said carefully. "I'm sure it's a misunderstanding. I'm just heading to work." Carter didn't seem to hear him and instead took a step toward him with a more intimidating posture. "What do you do?" "I'm a lawyer," Derek replied in a calm voice. "I have a meeting in an hour, so if there's nothing else, I'd like to continue on my way." This surprised Carter, whose serious expression hesitated for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Lawyer, huh?" he replied disdainfully. "I'm sure he's not hiding anything in that car, right?" Derek knew that this could get out of control at any moment. I had to stay calm. "There's nothing illegal in my car, officer. You can check it out if you want, but I'd rather you didn't waste your time," he replied, hoping to defuse the situation. "You don't decide how we do our job," Carter replied, hardening his tone. "Get away from the car." Derek hesitated for a second. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but the situation was dangerous. He heard his father's voice in his mind, reminding him to stay calm and be smart. "It's okay," Derek said, slowly raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. He took a step back, and suddenly Carter lunged at him, twisting his arm behind his back. The speed of the movement took Derek by surprise, and he felt a sharp pain in his shoulder. Before he could react, Roberts was already on top of him, pushing him to the ground. "What are they doing?" Derek protested, trying to stay calm despite the pain. He wasn't resisting, but the officers were acting as if he was. "He is under arrest for resisting arrest," Carter said, his voice cold as he adjusted the handcuffs on Derek's wrists. Derek's mind was racing at full speed. He had not resisted at any time. He had complied with every instruction. He had tried to reason with them. But none of that mattered. They had already made up their minds when they saw him. The commotion caught the attention of nearby passers-by. Margaret Hill, an elderly woman who lived in the building across the street, watched in horror from her balcony. She knew Derek, had seen him pass by many times, and knew he wasn't a troublemaker. "What are they doing to him?" he shouted, his voice trembling with indignation. "He has done nothing wrong!" A young couple walking their dog had also stopped. The man took out his phone and began recording. "This is crazy," he muttered to his girlfriend. "They are arresting him for no reason." Derek looked at the camera and, for a moment, felt a spark of hope. Perhaps the footage would later help prove what had happened, but for now, he was at the mercy of the officers. They were taken to the police car, carelessly pushing him into the back seat. As the crowd grew and people began to express their discontent, Derek knew he had to stay focused and careful with what he said, because anything could be used against him. Officer Adams, who had observed the scene from a distance, approached Carter and Roberts with a frown. "Hey, wait a minute," he called, his voice low. "Do you know who that man is?" Carter looked at him dismissively. "A lawyer who thinks he is ready," replied, without giving it importance. Adams shook his head, lowering his voice even more. "He is not just a lawyer. It's Derek Stone, a leading civil rights lawyer. I've read about him. He's handled high-profile cases." Carter's face hardened for a moment, hiding his surprise. "And what?" he replied with apparent confidence, but Adams noticed the doubt in his eyes. "It could be a big problem if this leaks out," Adams warned. The mention of Derek's name was beginning to arouse concern among the officers. They knew that if Derek's identity came to light, it would become a storm that could sweep them all away. As officers led Derek inside the precinct, the atmosphere changed. The station, normally bustling with activity, seemed cooler under fluorescent lights, with grey walls and a constant hum that created a tense atmosphere. Officers were walking quickly through the halls, some chatting quietly, others focused on their tasks, but all seemed to be on guard. Derek was escorted by Carter and Roberts to the registration area. There, a tired-looking officer, sitting behind a desk with a computer, barely looked up. "Name?" asked the officer in a monotone voice. "Derek Stone," replied Carter, before Derek could open his mouth. The officer typed in the name and checked the data on the screen, frowning slightly but saying nothing. Then he gestured for Carter to take Derek to the fingerprinting area. Derek knew that any mistake could make things worse, so he followed the instructions without protest. As they took his fingerprints, his mind worked quickly, trying to understand why he had been singled out and what consequences this would bring. Derek had faced discrimination before, but something about this situation seemed more premeditated, more calculated. After they took his fingerprints, they took him to a small cell at the back of the station. The cell was cramped, with a bench on one side and a metal toilet in the corner. The air smelled like disinfectant mixed with something sour and unpleasant. The officers pushed him inside and closed the door. "Make yourself comfortable," Roberts said in a sarcastic tone as he closed the cell. "You could be here for a while." Derek sat down on the bench and took a deep breath. He did not respond to provocations. I knew they were trying to get him out of his mind. It wouldn't give them that pleasure. He focused on staying calm and thinking about his next steps. As Carter and Roberts walked away, they exchanged a look. Although they tried to maintain a facade of indifference, Carter couldn't help but feel a knot in his stomach. There was something about this situation that made him nervous, something that didn't fit in with the usual routine. "He thinks he's a lawyer," Roberts said quietly. "He's just another guy in an expensive suit." Carter nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Something about the way Derek had handled the situation, the calm and confidence, didn't match the profiles of the people they used to stop. A few minutes later, young Officer Adams, who had been watching everything, approached Carter. Officer Carter said in a low voice, "I need to talk to you." Carter frowned, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "What's wrong?" "I think I know that guy they just brought in," Adams said, lowering his voice even more. "I saw an article about him a few weeks ago. He is not just a lawyer, he's a civil rights lawyer and a pretty important one. He has been involved in large cases." Carter's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his surprise. "Are you sure?" Adams replied positive. "I didn't recognize him at first, but when I heard his name, I remembered him. Maybe we should be careful with this one." Carter did not immediately respond. He felt a knot in his stomach, but ignored it. This could not be true. He had been arrested with all the law. There was no way it was someone important, but the doubt was there, growing inside her. "I'm going to handle this," Carter said curtly, waving Adams away. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. Adams watched as he left and pulled out his phone. He quickly searched his contacts for the number he needed and, taking a deep breath, made a call. The phone rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Yes, Captain, I'm Officer Adams. We have a situation here at the station, and I think you need to know about it." Meanwhile, in the cell, Derek remained seated, focused on staying calm. He knew this wasn't just about him, but about something much bigger. He had been arrested for no apparent reason, of that he was sure, but he did not know why and the possible implications. As time passed, he focused on his breathing, keeping his mind clear and prepared for whatever might come. An hour later, the door to the holding area burst open, and a woman walked in. She was a middle-aged officer, with a sharp gaze and an attitude that radiated authority. Her name was Laura Miller, and although she had only been at this station for a few weeks after being transferred from another district, she had already made it clear that she was someone not to be underestimated. Miller's eyes swept quickly around the room, assessing the situation. Her instincts told her something wasn't right. He had dealt with officers like Carter and Roberts before, men who believed they could bend the rules for their convenience. But she was different. She had risen in her career by being rigorous with the rules and expected the same from her team. "Officers Carter, Roberts, what's going on here?" Miller asked, approaching the table where they were talking quietly. Carter looked up, surprised by the lieutenant's arrival. "Nothing in particular, Lieutenant. Just another day of work," he replied, trying to sound carefree. Miller narrowed her eyes, not convinced. "Really, because I heard that they brought a man this morning, a certain Derek Stone." The slight rigidity in Carter's posture did not go unnoticed by Miller. "Yes, Lieutenant, that's right. We arrested him for resisting arrest," he replied in a firm voice, but the lack of conviction in his words was evident. Miller did not immediately respond. He took a moment to assess the situation before turning to Derek, who was sitting in his cell with a calm expression and an upright posture. He seemed to be waiting for things to take a logical course despite the situation. Miller walked toward the cell, approaching cautiously. "This is him?" he asked, looking over his shoulder at Carter. "Yes, Lieutenant," Carter replied, trying to maintain his indifferent tone. Miller said no more. He took out the keys and opened the cell door, entering with firm steps and maintaining his composure. Derek looked up and looked at her calmly, keeping a steady but no hostile gaze. "Mr. Stone," Miller began in a measured voice, "I am Lieutenant Laura Miller, and I am here to ask you a few questions." "Of course, Lieutenant," Derek replied politely. "I'm ready to cooperate." Miller nodded, appreciating Derek's composure. He had been informed that he had resisted arrest, but the calm and confidence in his tone made him doubt that version. "I'm told you resisted arrest, which led to you being brought here," Miller continued, looking for any clue in Derek's expression. "I would like to hear your version of what happened." Derek held his gaze without blinking. "Lieutenant, at no time did I resist. I followed all the instructions given by Officers Carter and Roberts. I asked them why I was being detained, and apparently that simple question was enough to escalate the situation. Before I knew it, I was handcuffed and accused of resisting despite complying with all his orders." Miller listened intently, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed his words. There was something about Derek's tone that convinced her that he was telling the truth. Measured calmness, but with an underlying firmness that wasn't common for someone who was simply trying to avoid trouble. She turned to Carter, who was watching her a few paces away. "Is that true, Officer Carter?" he asked, his voice high-pitched. Carter stirred uncomfortably. "Well, Lieutenant, you questioned our authority and the situation became tense. We had reason to believe that he might be hiding something. And what exactly was that reason?" Miller asked, his tone showing disbelief. Carter hesitated, unable to find a convincing answer. "It was just a hunch, Lieutenant," he muttered. "A hunch?" Miller repeated, with evident incredulity in his voice. "Is that enough for an arrest?" At that moment, the door to the holding area opened again, and Officer Adams hurriedly walked in, his face somewhat agitated. He paused as he saw the group gathered, noticing the palpable tension. "Lieutenant, I need to talk to you," he said quickly, casting a meaningful glance at Derek and then at Carter. Miller took one last look at Carter before leaving the cell and closing the door behind her. "What's wrong, Adams?" Adams lowered his voice, trying to keep the conversation as private as possible. "I've been doing some research, and Derek Stone isn't just an attorney. He's a leading civil rights attorney and has worked on some high-profile cases. If this gets out of hand, it could be a disaster for everyone." Miller's face hardened as the information swept through his mind. I already suspected that there was more to this situation than it seemed, but now I was beginning to understand the magnitude of the problem. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "Completely confident," Adams replied, pulling out his phone and showing a page with Derek Stone's profile. "This is him. If this leaks, we will have something much more serious than a simple internal investigation on our hands." Miller felt the weight of the situation fall on her. I needed to act fast before this became a scandal. "Carter, Roberts, I want a full report of this arrest," he said finally, his tone of voice making it clear that it was not a request. "And Adams, go let Chief Grant know that we need a meeting right away." As the officers dispersed to carry out their orders, Miller took a moment to take a deep breath. She knew a storm was coming and she needed to be prepared to face it head-on. As officers scrambled to carry out Lieutenant Miller's orders, in Police Chief Frank Grant's office, tensions were already beginning to rise. Chief Grant was a man of authoritarian bearing, with years of service and a reputation forged both in his successes and in his ability to deal with delicate situations. However, this particular situation clearly had him upset. He had vaguely learned that an important lawyer had been arrested, but the details were still hazy for him. When Adams arrived at his office and explained the magnitude of the problem, Chief Grant's countenance changed from mild annoyance to deep concern. I knew what it meant to have a high-profile civil rights attorney detained without just cause. It wasn't just a matter of image, but a risk of lawsuits and losing control over public trust in their station. "Officer Adams, gather everyone involved and tell them to meet in the conference room in 5 minutes, Grant ordered, pursing his lips. "This has to be resolved before the situation gets out of hand." Adams nodded and hurried to carry out the orders. Meanwhile, Grant was mentally reviewing how to approach the problem. He needed to be firm, but also cautious. A single mistake, and the entire department could be under scrutiny. In the conference room, Officers Carter and Roberts waited uneasily, accompanied by Lieutenant Miller, who maintained a firm posture and a tense expression. Carter was visibly nervous, while Roberts tried to maintain a facade of tranquility, though his fingers drummed anxiously on the table. Grant walked into the room with a determined step, slamming the door behind him tightly. The expression on his face made it clear that he was unwilling to accept excuses. "What the hell is going on here?" Grant asked, not bothering to soften his tone. Carter cleared his throat, glancing sideways at Roberts for support. "Sir, we follow the procedure," he began, but Grant interrupted him with a wave of his hand. "I don't want excuses, Carter. I want answers. We have detained a civil rights attorney for no apparent cause, and now I have a federal agent out of my office wanting explanations." Roberts swallowed. "We didn't know who he was, sir. We thought he was acting suspiciously, and when he questioned our orders, we assumed that—" "Assumed?" Grant repeated, his icy tone. "Now what? Are we going to assume the consequences too?" Miller intervened, trying to bring the situation into focus. "Chief Grant is not only an attorney, he is a civil rights attorney with a significant reputation. In addition, according to Officer Adams, he is involved in a federal investigation into police corruption and abuse in local departments. If this comes to light, it's not just about this department, but about the entire community." Grant let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing his forehead with one hand. I knew this went far beyond the wrongful arrest of a man. It was an issue that could trigger a public crisis of great proportions. "We need to release Derek Stone immediately and issue a formal apology," Grant said in a determined tone. "And I want a meeting with the federal agent in my office. We cannot allow this to become a major scandal." Carter and Roberts nodded, knowing there was nothing more they could do at this point. Grant's look at them made it clear that their careers hung by a very thin thread. Miller, on the other hand, felt a mixture of relief and concern. At least something was being done to remedy the situation, but I knew that the consequences would not end here. As Grant arranged for Derek's release, the murmur of voices outside the station increased. The community had begun to learn of the arrest, and a sizable group of people had already gathered in front of the station demanding explanations and justice. When Miller made his way to Derek's cell to break the news, he mentally prepared himself for the conversation. I knew that even though Derek would be released, this wasn't the end of the problem. He opened the cell door and entered calmly, finding Derek sitting there, watching with a neutral gaze. "Mr. Stone, I have looked at the situation, and it is clear that there was a misunderstanding." "You're free to go," Miller said, trying to sound professional. Derek slowly stood up, his eyes examining Miller suspiciously. "A misunderstanding, Lieutenant," he repeated, his words steeped in skepticism. Miller held his gaze. "I deeply regret what happened today. I shouldn't have gotten that far." Derek kept his posture upright, assessing the sincerity in his words before nodding cautiously. "I appreciate your apology, Lieutenant, but this is not over." Miller knew he was right. This was just the beginning of something much bigger, and the tension at the station confirmed that everyone knew it. As he escorted Derek to the exit, the officers who passed them avoided looking him in the eye, aware of the mistake that had been made. When they reached the main entrance, the shouts and chants of the crowd grew louder. Grant was waiting for them by the door, his expression tense and ready for what lay ahead. Derek stepped outside, and the crowd's roar turned into cheers and applause at the sight of him. Reporters' cameras began rolling, and questions were thrown into the air, but Derek kept his gaze fixed on his family and friends, who had come to support him. Chief Grant grabbed a microphone at the entrance and began to speak, his voice trying to convey equal parts authority and regret. "Good afternoon. I want to begin by acknowledging the events that occurred this morning. The arrest of Mr. Derek Stone was a mistake, one that should not have happened. I take full responsibility for what happened and want to offer my sincere apologies to Mr. Stone and the community." The crowd remained in an awkward silence, waiting for more than words. Derek, meanwhile, took a step forward and raised a hand for Chief Grant to stop. "Chief Grant, I appreciate the apology, but this isn't just about apologies. It's about action. True justice goes beyond words. It requires real change, true accountability, and sincere commitment." Grant nodded slowly, knowing that a simple speech would not be enough to diffuse the situation. The community was tired of empty promises and cases that faded away without tangible change. Derek continued to speak, addressing the crowd, his voice resounding with firmness and determination. "We've heard apologies before, but now we need a commitment to real and lasting change. We need to make sure that those in power are held accountable for their actions, and that we work together to create a system that treats everyone with justice and dignity." The crowd responded with applause and cheers, finding in his words the hope of genuine change. Derek had managed to capture everyone's attention, not only as a victim of a police error, but as a leader willing to fight for justice for all. As applause and cheers spread through the crowd, Derek took a moment to look at the faces around him. There were expressions of relief, pride, and a firm determination to see real change. Derek knew that words alone wouldn't be enough, but he also knew that this was just the first step in a longer struggle. As Derek walked away from the microphone, he reached out to his family and friends, hugging them tightly. Lieutenant Miller watched from the doorway, aware that things inside the station were far from settled. She intended to lead internal investigations and was determined not to let this incident go unpunished. At the same time, Chief Grant watched the crowd with a mixture of concern and reflection. He knew that, in the coming weeks, his leadership would be tested like never before. He needed to demonstrate to the community that the department was not simply reacting to an incident, but was committed to making deep and sustainable changes. As the crowd began to disperse, Federal Agent Mark Williams, a tall man with a serious countenance, approached Chief Grant with a determined step. Williams had been watching from the corner, assessing the situation and preparing for his next move. "Chief Grant, we need to talk," Williams said, keeping his voice firm and direct. Grant looked at him grimly, knowing that the conversation he was about to have would not be easy. "I understand, Agent Williams. Let's go to my office," Grant replied, as they both headed toward the station entrance. Inside the boss's office, the tension was palpable. Williams wasted no time in rodeos. "Chief Grant, what has happened here today is not an isolated incident. Derek Stone has been part of a broader federal investigation into corruption and abuses of power in several police departments, including his own," Williams said, looking directly into Grant's eyes. "If this is handled the wrong way, it could have devastating repercussions not only for you, but for the entire city." Grant ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of his decisions fall on him. For years, he had avoided facing certain problems head-on, convinced that small compromises were necessary to keep the peace. Now, those commitments were about to fall apart, exposing everything he had let go. "What do you want me to do?" Grant asked, trying to stay calm. Williams leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation. "For starters, we need a complete change in your internal procedures. Every officer involved in this type of behavior should be disciplined or removed from his or her post. In addition, the community should have a voice in internal investigations, and an independent oversight board should be established." Grant listened quietly, knowing he didn't have much choice. The prospect of facing a federal investigation was something that would jeopardize not only his career, but the entire structure of the department. But he also understood that this was an opportunity to do the right thing, something he had eluded for far too long. Meanwhile, Derek, who had returned home after the tumultuous day, sat in his living room next to his mother, who was looking at him with concern. A lot had happened in such a short amount of time, and they were both trying to process what this meant for the future. "Derek, you have to be careful," his mother told him, in a tone that mixed pride and fear. "You know what we face when you mess with the system." Derek nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words. "I knew this better than anyone, but I also knew that if I didn't seize this moment, the opportunity for real change might vanish." "I'm not alone in this, Mum, and if we don't fight now, we never will," he replied with determination. In the days that followed, things began to move quickly. Derek met with community leaders, activists, and legal experts to develop a strategy to keep the pressure on the police department and ensure that promises of reform didn't remain empty words. At the same time, inside the police station, Lieutenant Miller met with key officers to initiate internal investigations, emphasizing the need for transparency and accountability. At one of these meetings, Miller addressed the officers in a determined tone. "I know some of you think this is just a media storm that will pass, but you're wrong. We are at a tipping point, and if we don't act correctly, we could lose everything. I am not going to allow them to hide anything. If any of you think you can cover up the mistakes of the past, I suggest you reconsider your stance." The officers exchanged glances, realizing that things had changed. The arrival of a federal agent and public scrutiny had made it clear to them that the old way of doing things would no longer work. As the weeks went by, new training programs began to be implemented for officers, focused on de-escalation techniques and cultural awareness. In addition, a new community oversight council was created, where democratically elected citizens could review cases of misconduct and work alongside Lieutenant Miller to ensure accountability. Derek, for his part, was not satisfied with observing from afar. He became a key figure in efforts to build a more just community. He was invited to speak at meetings with rookie officers, where he shared his experience and perspective on the importance of justice and human dignity. In one of these sessions, while addressing a group of young recruits, Derek was met with curious and some defiant looks. He understood that for many of them, he represented a criticism of their way of doing things, but he also saw in their eyes the possibility of change. "Good morning, my name is Derek Stone, and I'm here to talk to you about justice. Not just the one you'll be sworn to uphold, but the one that goes beyond badges and courts," Derek began in a calm but firm voice. "Justice is about treating each person with dignity and respect, of not assuming anything based on their appearance, but of listening and observing with empathy. At the end of the session, one of the recruits, a young woman named Sarah Johnson, approached nervously. "Mr. Stone, I just wanted to thank you for coming today. I entered the academy because I wanted to make a difference, but after everything that has happened, I began to doubt. Listening to him has reminded me why I am here." Derek smiled, touched by his sincerity. "Don't lose that spirit, Sarah. We need people like you, willing to do the right thing, willing to question and learn." As the months passed, the changes in the community became more and more visible. Although there were still incidents and challenges to be faced, there was a sense of hope and collaboration that did not exist before. Derek had accomplished more than just exposing a problem. He had started a movement toward a more just and transparent community. The road wouldn't be easy, and Derek knew it. But with each step forward, he felt more confident that change was possible and worth fighting for one day at a time. As time progressed, the community began to see small but significant changes as a result of joint efforts between citizens and authorities. Derek Stone had not only succeeded in exposing a problem, but had helped build a path to a more just future. However, the fight for real change was only the beginning of a long and challenging journey. Derek had become a key figure in the city, not only as a lawyer, but also as an advocate for a new way of doing justice. His meetings with community leaders and city officials began to bear fruit. A free legal aid program was established for people who could not afford adequate representation, and a new officer selection process was implemented that included more rigorous psychological evaluations and training programs in empathy and social justice. One afternoon at a meeting at the community centre, Derek was surrounded by a diverse mix of people: activists, concerned citizens, teachers, and even local business owners. There was a palpable energy in the room, a sense of urgency and purpose that Derek recognized as the sign of a growing movement. "We're here to make real, lasting change," said Maria Ramos, the teacher who had been working closely with Derek on implementing educational programs for local schools. "Students need to learn from a young age what it means to live in a just and equitable society. We need to make sure that they understand their rights and responsibilities as citizens, and above all, that they learn to challenge what is wrong." Derek nodded, taking the floor. "You're right, Maria. Education is central to any sustainable change, but we also need a multifaceted approach. We cannot ignore the immediate needs of those who are suffering injustice right now. That is why we must also strengthen legal aid and psychological support for victims of police misconduct or discrimination." As they argued, the passion in the room was undeniable. People were beginning to feel empowered to take an active role in the change they longed to see. They had gone from being spectators to active participants, and that was a crucial development. At the same time, inside the police station, Lieutenant Miller continued to fight to clean up the image and operation of her department. Each day he found himself dealing with the aftermath of the incident, dealing with internal resistance and systemic issues that had come to light. Still, Miller stood her ground, determined to do the right thing. One afternoon, during a command meeting at the station, Miller addressed the officers present in a tone that mixed firmness and frustration. "We are implementing new transparency and accountability policies, and this is not optional. I know there are those who think this process is a threat to the way we've done things, but let me be clear. If you don't want to be here to comply with these new rules, I will find those who are," she warned, leaving no room for doubt. The officers exchanged glances, and while some remained rigid and impassive, others were beginning to accept that times were changing. The old customs and practices were not to be tolerated much longer. A few days later, Derek was invited to participate in a roundtable hosted by the city, which included Chief Grant, Lieutenant Miller, Federal Agent Williams, and several community leaders. The meeting, broadcast live by local media, was aimed at showing a united front for reform. "Thank you for joining us today," began Grant, who had taken a more humble and conscientious stance since the incident. "We know there is a long way to go, but we want to demonstrate our commitment to justice and equality." Derek leaned forward in his seat, aware of the cameras, but more focused on the message he wanted to convey. "We all know that words alone are not enough," he said, his voice clear and firm. "What we need are concrete actions, and I am here to make sure that those actions are carried out. The community deserves more than promises. Officer Williams took the floor, reinforcing Derek's words. Federal oversight will be here to ensure that changes are not only promised but delivered. We've seen too many incidents across the country where promises of reform have faded over time. We cannot allow that to happen here. The discussion continued for more than an hour, addressing topics ranging from new guidelines for the use of force to civic education programs for young people. The community was watching and evaluating every word, looking for signs of real commitment or old, empty rhetoric. By the end of the roundtable, Derek felt optimistic, even though he knew they couldn't afford to let their guard down. As he made his way to the exit, he crossed paths with Chief Grant, who stopped him with a gesture. "Stone," Grant said in a more conciliatory tone than Derek had heard before, "I want you to know that we are taking this seriously. I'm not going to let this be just a passing moment." Derek looked at him intently, looking for sincerity in his words. "I hope you mean it, Chief Grant, because this city has had enough broken promises. People need to see change, not just hear it." That night, Derek met with his team at the community center to take stock of the progress. The conversation was long but productive. There was a renewed sense of purpose and unity in the group, and everyone agreed that the challenges they faced were enormous but not insurmountable. As the weeks turned into months, the police station began to reflect the changes in trainings and attitudes. Some officers, like the young Stevens, were eager to get things right, while others remained reticent, sticking to the old way of doing things. However, the external and internal pressure was working, and the results were beginning to show. Derek, for his part, continued to visit schools and talk to students about justice and civil rights. On one such visit, he met a high school student named Jamal who approached him after a talk. "Mr. Stone, do you think things are really going to change?" asked the young man with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Derek smiled, seeing in Jamal's eyes the reflection of his own doubts and youthful dreams. "Things are already changing, Jamal. But real change depends on all of us. It's not enough to just wait for someone else to do it for us. We must be the voice and action that demands justice." As he returned to his office that afternoon, Derek thought about how much his life had changed since that fateful arrest. What had begun as a traumatic experience had morphed into a mission to build something better. "I knew there were many challenges ahead, but I also knew I wasn't alone." In the coming weeks, efforts continued to expand. The community saw the creation of pilot programs in several schools, developed by Maria Ramos and other educators, focused on teaching students conflict resolution skills and knowledge of their civil rights. In addition, the police station was renovated in both structure and purpose, with new supervision programs and more training in interpersonal skills and peaceful resolution. The road to justice is never easy, Derek thought one night as he reviewed legal documents in his office. But with each step forward, more people joined the march, and each voice grew louder. Despite the moments of frustration and inevitable setbacks, Derek felt increasingly confident that they were on the right track. Small changes were the foundation of something bigger, something that could transform not only the city, but the lives of all who had lost faith in the system. As the stars shone in the city's night sky, Derek felt a sense of peace mixed with determination. "I knew there was a lot of work to be done, and new challenges to be faced. But as long as there were people willing to fight for change, it was worth every effort and every sacrifice." In that moment, he knew that he was not simply fighting the past, but building a future where justice was not just a word, but a lived reality for all. Months passed, and the reforms and community efforts that Derek Stone, Lieutenant Miller, and other leaders had promoted began to transform the city in a profound and sustained way. Although there were tensions, the implementation of new policies and the strengthening of the relationship between the police and the community were bearing fruit. But Derek knew that fighting for real change required a steady, determined approach. One day, while reviewing cases in his office, Derek received an unexpected call from his colleague and mentor, retired Judge Marcus Holden. Marcus had been an ardent advocate for civil rights and justice in his years as a judge, and he was one of the people who inspired Derek to pursue his legal path. "Derek, I need to see you," Marcus said, his voice deep and serious. "It is something important." Intrigued, Derek agreed to meet Marcus at a small cafe they both frequented. When he arrived, he found Marcus waiting for him at a secluded table, with a stack of documents in front of him. "Thanks for coming," Derek began Marcus, greeting him with a tired smile. "I have been receiving troubling information about the movements of certain groups within the city. I think there's organized resistance to the change you're promoting." Derek frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus lowered his voice, reviewing the documents. "I've been in touch with a few sources, and it appears that there is a group of retired officers and influential business leaders who oppose the reforms. They believe that all this threatens order and their personal interests." Derek looked at the papers warily. He knew that by initiating this movement he would face opposition, but the mention of powerful and coordinated figures worried him. "Thanks for the warning, Marcus." "I'll make sure to stay alert," Derek replied, feeling the urge to stand his ground. That same day, Derek met with his team at the community center to address this new threat. He knew that reforms were vulnerable if those with power and influence began to sabotage them. At the meeting were Maria Ramos, youth activist Jaden Clark, community psychologist Angela Green, and other key leaders who had been collaborating since the beginning. "We are seeing progress, but also resistance. There are people who see our reforms as a threat to their control," Derek said, looking at those present. "We need to be strategic and organize ourselves even better. It's not just about standing up for what we've achieved, it's about making sure that these changes are permanent." Jaden, who had been organizing youth to join the movement, weighed in. "We can mobilize young people to actively participate in municipal meetings. If the community sees the youth involved, it will be harder for these opponents to delegitimize our work." Angela, who had been working with victims of police abuse to provide emotional support, added, "And not only that, we need to strengthen psychological support and accompaniment. Resistance to change can make people feel vulnerable and exposed. We must protect them." Derek nodded, feeling stronger with his team's backing. He knew that he was not alone, and that the strength of the movement lay in its diversity and determination. At the same time, inside the police station, Lieutenant Miller continued to navigate the complicated waters of domestic politics. She had faced criticism from some local officials and leaders for being too harsh or too soft, depending on who you asked, but she was determined not to give in to the pressure. One afternoon, Miller was called to a meeting with federal agent Mark Williams. He had been closely monitoring the progress on the station, and he was there to make sure that the reforms were not just in words. "Lieutenant Miller, the results of the first audits are promising, but we need to keep the momentum going. Federal oversight won't last forever. We need the department to be self-sustaining in these reforms," Williams said. "I know, Agent Williams," Miller replied seriously, "but we have had some setbacks with certain officers and sectors of the community. There is resistance to change." Williams nodded, aware of the challenges. "Let me be clear, Lieutenant. If any sign is detected that this process is being intentionally sabotaged, I will take swift and decisive action. I don't want excuses. I don't want delays." Miller knew Williams wasn't kidding. Federal oversight was temporary, and the burden of maintaining the integrity of the department rested on his shoulders. However, he had gained important allies within the force, such as the young officer Stevens, who had shown a genuine desire to improve. Stevens, in his growing role as a liaison between the community and the police, organized a series of meetings where citizens could voice their concerns directly to officers. These meetings, while tense, became an open and candid forum for discussing problems and solutions. At one of these meetings, a mother named Rachel Turner stood up to talk about the harassment her teenage son had suffered at the hands of the police. Rachel's voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as she told her son's story and the injustices he had experienced. Derek, who was present as an observer, felt the excitement of the crowd grow with every word from Rachel. When he finished speaking, several officers rose to apologize and promise improvements, including Chief Grant, who took the floor to reaffirm his commitment to transparency and change. "What happened to your son shouldn't have happened, and it won't happen again, Mrs. Turner," Grant said, maintaining a solemn tone. As the meetings continued, Derek and his team worked on new community justice and awareness programs. But Derek knew there was still a lot to do, especially in the fight to sustain these changes. In an attempt to consolidate the reforms, Derek met with local business leaders, seeking their support to fund social justice education and training programs. He knew that they needed the financial and political backing to maintain the stability of the new initiatives. However, not all leaders were willing to support him. During one of the meetings, an influential businessman named Jonathan Caldwell made his displeasure clear. "Mr. Stone, I have run businesses in this city for more than 30 years, and I don't see why I should fund a movement that could destabilize my company and the local economy," Caldwell said coldly. Derek remained calm, knowing it was an uphill battle. "We are not here to destabilize anything, Mr. Caldwell. We're here to build something better for everyone. Long-term stability can only be achieved if there is fairness and transparency. Without that, the local economy will be the least of their worries." Derek's words resonated with some businessmen present, although not all. It was a reminder that the road to real justice was fraught with obstacles, and that support would not be universal. As Derek was leaving the meeting, he was approached by Sarah Johnson, the young officer he had met during his visit to the academy. "Mr. Stone, I know things are tense, but I want you to know that there are many of us in the force who want this to work. I volunteered for the new mentoring programs because I believe that, with the right direction, we can make real change," Sarah said, her eyes shining with determination. Derek smiled, feeling a renewed hope. "Thank you, Sarah. We need everyone who is willing to fight for this. And don't worry, I'm here to support you too." As new challenges approached and victories cemented, Derek felt that the movement he had started was stronger than ever. The community had woken up and was ready to fight for a better future, and although the path was full of uncertainties, every day there were more allies willing to take that path together. The reforms were not just laws or rules, they were people working for the common good. And for Derek, that was the biggest sign of success. Because when people fight together for change, there is no barrier they can't break down. As the months passed, the city began to see a tangible shift in the dynamics between the community and the police, but tensions with those resisting reforms also intensified. Derek Stone, along with his team and new allies within the police department, was dedicated to consolidating the changes and gaining more support among citizens, even in the most reluctant sectors. However, the situation remained delicate. At one of the regular community meetings, Maria Ramos presented an encouraging report on school programs. Students were responding well to social justice and empathy classes, and a civil rights curriculum had been implemented in every school in the district. But Maria, always concerned about the well-being of young people, was quick to point out the new threats that were emerging. "Derek, some parents have told me that their children have started to receive bullying from certain students who are apparently influenced by outside figures. I can't prove it, but I'm sure those groups we talked about earlier are behind it," Maria warned with a frown. Derek nodded, making a mental note. He knew that the changes generated resistance, especially among those who saw their privileges threatened. "We'll keep a watchful eye, Maria. We can also work on conflict resolution programs in schools. We cannot allow these influences to impair what we have accomplished." In parallel, Lieutenant Laura Miller had intensified her internal investigations within the police department. It was determined to eliminate any traces of corruption or malpractice that could threaten the reforms. However, he knew that some of his older officers were reluctant to change, and he feared that some of them were secretly collaborating with those who opposed reforms. One day, while reviewing the conduct reports, he found discrepancies in the records of some officers, especially a group led by Sergeant Tom Barrett, a veteran with more than 20 years in the service. Barrett had been an influential figure in the department for a long time, and Laura suspected he was unwilling to accept the changes easily. She called Barrett into her office, determined to confront him. The sergeant, a burly man with an air of authority, entered with a neutral expression, but his eyes reflected discomfort. "Sergeant Barrett, I have noticed some irregularities in the reports of certain recent operations. It appears that important details have been omitted or data has been altered," Laura said, showing him the documents. Barrett looked at the papers, feigning surprise. "I don't know what you're talking about, Lieutenant. I have always been clear in my reports." Laura looked at him suspiciously. He knew Barrett was cunning and wouldn't leave traces easily, but he also knew he couldn't sit idly by. This is a warning, Sergeant. I recommend that you make sure that your reports are flawless from now on, and if I discover any future irregularities, I will not hesitate to take severe measures. Barrett withdrew, his face serious, but Miller could feel the tension in the air. He knew that Barrett was one of the informal leaders among the officers resisting change, and this confrontation was just the beginning. In that context, Derek received an invitation to participate in a local television program that was generating a lot of interest in the community. The program was called Voices of the City and was hosted by Gina Harper, a journalist respected for her impartiality and her ability to tackle difficult issues. Gina wanted Derek and Chief Grant to face off in a public discussion about reforms and the future of the city. Derek agreed, knowing that this was a crucial opportunity to show the community what was being accomplished while also publicly challenging Chief Grant to truly commit to change. On the day of the show, the studio was full and the audience was expectant. Gina Harper opened the discussion with a direct question. Chief Grant, it has been almost a year since the incident involving Mr. Stone. The city has seen a lot of change, but do you think enough has been done to restore community trust? Grant, with a firm stance and a controlled voice, responded, We have worked hard to implement reforms that ensure transparency and accountability. While there is still much to be done, I am committed to leading this department into a new era of trust and cooperation. Derek waited patiently for his turn before speaking. While I appreciate Chief Grant's commitment, the community needs more than words. We have seen reforms, yes, but we have also seen resistance, both inside the department and outside. We can't let this opportunity for real change be lost through inaction or fear of upsetting those who don't want to accept that things are changing, Derek said, with a steady eye toward Grant. Gina Harper picked up on the tension in the room and took the opportunity to delve into the subject. Mr. Stone, there have been reports that certain groups within the community and the police are actively opposed to these reforms. Do you think that jeopardizes the progress that has been made? Derek took a moment to respond, aware of the impact of his words. Resistance to change is normal, and sometimes even healthy, when it is based on a legitimate desire to improve. But when that resistance comes from those who try to protect their privileges at the expense of justice and fairness, then it becomes an obstacle that we must overcome. The show continued with questions from the audience, and although there were disagreements and tension, Derek left the studio with the feeling that he had served his purpose, to publicly pressure the police department and motivate the community to stay alert. The next day, Derek received a call from journalist Gina Harper. There was a tone of urgency in his voice. Derek, after the show, I received a series of anonymous messages insinuating that someone within the department is leaking information to those who oppose reforms. This could mean they're planning to sabotage community programs, or even some outright retaliation, said Gina, visibly worried. Derek was silent for a moment, weighing the information. He knew that the road to justice was dangerous, but he also knew that he could not turn back now. Thanks for telling me, Gina. I will take precautions and do my best to find out who is behind this, he replied determinedly. In the days that followed, Derek met with his team, including Maria Ramos, Jaden Clark and Angela Green, to discuss the risks and plan how to proceed. They agreed to step up security measures and continue to closely monitor any signs of sabotage. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Miller, increasingly determined to clean up her apartment, redoubled her efforts to identify potential saboteurs. She knew she faced internal enemies, but she was determined not to let anything undermine the work she had started. The atmosphere in the city remained tense, but as community leaders, reformist officers, and committed citizens stood together, there was a growing sense that, despite the challenges, they were building something worth protecting. Derek knew that the fight for justice would never be easy, but as long as there were people willing to face obstacles together, he was convinced that change was possible. And with each passing day, more citizens were joining the cause, strengthening the movement and demonstrating that the power of a united community could overcome any resistance. As tensions continued and reforms took shape, Derek Stone and his team realized they were entering a new phase of their fight for justice. They had made significant gains, but now faced organized resistance, led by people with power and influence in the city. One day, during a strategic meeting, Maria Ramos revealed some worrying information. He had received anonymous messages suggesting that certain business leaders were funding groups to discredit the reforms and undermine the influence of Derek and his team. "This isn't just opposition, Derek," Maria warned seriously. "They are trying to discredit us and divide the community. We need to be prepared to stand up for our work and show that we are transparent and accountable." Derek knew they had to stay ahead of this threat. If the saboteurs succeeded in sowing doubt about the reforms, all the trust gained could quickly collapse. They decided to take direct action. They convened a series of open forums where the community would be allowed to voice their concerns and ask questions of reform leaders and police officers who supported the change. These forums would be recorded and live-streamed in an attempt to demonstrate transparency and commitment to the truth. At the first forum, Derek was accompanied by Maria Angela Green and the young activist Jaden Clark. In addition, Lieutenant Miller and Officer Stevens teamed up to represent the police, something that surprised many skeptical citizens. The attendance was massive, with a mix of citizens, journalists and opponents interested in seeing how the event would unfold. Derek stepped forward to the microphone, taking a moment to breathe before speaking. "Thank you for being here today. We know there are concerns, rumors and many questions. That's why we're here to answer them and show them that there's nothing to hide," Derek began in a firm but welcoming voice. The questions began to flow, and some of them were difficult and confrontational. Several citizens rose to express their frustration with the past and their doubts about the future. Derek and his team answered candidly, avoiding any topics. However, during the round of questions, an older man with an air of authority stood up and took the microphone. His name was Arthur Collins, an influential businessman and one of the leaders of the opposition to the reforms. "Mr. Stone," Collins said politely but defiantly, "can you assure us that these reforms are not just a facade to gain political power and that they are actually achieving results? Because so far we have only seen chaos and divisions." Derek remained calm, though he knew Collins was looking to discredit him publicly. Instead of evading the question, he decided to face it head-on. "Thank you for the question, Mr. Collins. Transparency and accountability are central to our approach. That's why we're here, to show you, the community, everything we're doing. We know that real change takes time and that there will always be those who want to cling to the past. But I can assure you that every decision we make is based on a simple goal: to create a fairer and safer city for everyone," Derek replied with a confident look. Derek's words echoed through the crowd, and while some were still skeptical, others began to nod. The presence of Lieutenant Miller and Officer Stevens also helped soften distrust of police, as both answered difficult questions about the internal handling of the reforms. After the forum, Derek met with his team to assess how it all turned out. They knew there was still a lot of work to be done, but they had taken an important step towards transparency. Meanwhile, at the police station, Lieutenant Miller received an unexpected visit from Federal Agent Mark Williams. He had been closely following recent developments and was concerned about reports from organized anti-reform groups. "Lieutenant Miller, I have received information that some influential figures within the city are trying to influence their officers to discredit this process," Williams warned. "I need to know if you have detected anything suspicious inside your computer." Miller nodded, aware of the seriousness of the situation. He had been keeping a close eye on his officers, especially the group led by Sergeant Barrett, and although there was no concrete evidence, he had seen signs of disloyalty. "There are officers who are questioning the changes, and not in the constructive way we expect. I'm taking steps to address it, but it's a constant struggle," Miller replied, his tone full of determination. Williams nodded, satisfied with the answer. "I trust your leadership, Lieutenant, but remember, if I detect that someone is actively sabotaging these efforts, I will not hesitate to intervene." Miller knew she had fragile support, but she was determined to move on. He made his way to the common room and gathered a group of young officers, including Stevens and Sarah Johnson. "I want to thank you all for your dedication and commitment to change," Miller began, addressing his team firmly. "I know that it is not easy, and that there are those who would prefer that everything remained the same. But we're here to make a difference, and I want you to know that you have my full support." Stevens and Johnson, among others, were grateful for Miller's endorsement. They had taken a big risk by publicly supporting the reforms, and they needed to know that they were not alone. By the end of that day, Derek and his team were reviewing the results of the forum when Jaden Clark, the young activist, approached Derek with a new idea. "Derek, I've been thinking about how to get more young people involved in this movement. Many of them feel disconnected from all of this because they don't fully understand what we're doing. How about we organize creative workshops where they can express their experiences and concerns through art or music?" Jaden asked excitedly. Derek smiled, impressed by Jaden's initiative. "I love the idea, Jaden. Creativity is a powerful tool for connecting people and inspiring change." "Let's do it," Derek replied, convinced that it was a great way to get more people involved in the cause. As the creative workshops took shape, Derek also received a message from journalist Gina Harper, who had been further investigating opposition groups. He had new information about the financial connections of certain businessmen and retired officers with the leaders of these groups. "Derek, I think I've found a pattern in the donations and funding of these groups. We need to talk in person. This could be a big blow to the saboteurs," Gina wrote to him. Derek knew this was crucial. The fight for justice was not just about implementing reforms, but about standing up to those who used their power and influence to oppose change. As he prepared to meet with Gina, he realized that they were at a turning point in their movement. They had managed to unite the community and win the support of key leaders, but the enemies were also reorganizing. Derek understood that the fight for a better future was not a sprint, but a marathon in which every step mattered. And as the city moved toward an uncertain fate, Derek and his team were ready to continue to face the challenges, confident that justice would prevail if they continued to fight together. With the newly obtained information from Gina Harper, Derek Stone began to devise a plan to expose the saboteurs and expose their intentions to the community. He knew that if they could clearly show how certain business leaders and retired officials were working to undermine the reforms, they would succeed in entrenching community support and weakening internal resistance. Derek met Gina at a low-key cafe on the outskirts of town. Gina handed him a dossier with detailed information, financial documents, and leaked emails that indicated how powerful figures such as Arthur Collins and retired Sergeant Tom Barrett were funding and coordinating efforts to discredit the reforms. "This is explosive," Gina Derek said as he flipped through the documents. "If this comes to light, we can completely change the narrative." Gina nodded gravely. "I know, Derek, but there are also risks. These people have connections and will not hesitate to defend themselves in any way possible." Derek knew Gina was right. The battle was not only legal and political, but also personal. But he was convinced that by exposing the truth, they could dismantle the obstacles that had been holding back the city's progress. With this information, Derek and his team decided to hold a press conference to publicly present the findings. They also began reaching out to allies within the government and community leaders to make sure that when the time came to make the revelations, they would have a united front supporting the reforms. At the same time, at the police station, Lieutenant Miller was having difficulty controlling discontent among certain officers. He knew there was a growing risk that some agents were involved in activities that could compromise investigations. One night, while reviewing records in his office, young Officer Stevens knocked on his door. He looked nervous, which wasn't typical for him. "Lieutenant Miller, there's something I need to tell you," Stevens confessed, lowering his voice. "I think some officers are planning something to sabotage the investigations. I've heard rumors that they're going to manipulate the reports to make the reforms look like a failure." Miller frowned, his concern mounting. "Who is involved?" he asked, his voice full of determination. "I don't have specific names yet, but I know Sergeant Barrett has been meeting with some veteran officers after their shifts," Stevens replied. Miller knew this required quick and precise action. He could not afford mistakes, as the situation was too delicate. He decided to keep Stevens as his informant and quietly arrange for more rigorous monitoring of the officers' records and activities. The next day, Derek received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end of the line was cold and threatening. "Stone, you know you're messing with very powerful people. If you keep going, you'll not only harm yourself, but everyone around you," the voice warned before abruptly hanging up. Derek remained silent, staring at the phone in his hand. He knew that these threats were a sign that he was getting too close to the truth. But instead of being intimidated, he felt a renewed determination. He met with his team to prepare for the press conference, but also to plan a stricter security plan, knowing that threats could be more than just words. At the same time, the community began to mobilize to support Derek and the reforms. Jaden Clark and Angela Green led a series of community meetings to inform citizens about the progress and threats they faced. Through these meetings, they were able to gather more support and motivate people to stand firm in their commitment to change. During one of these meetings, an elderly woman named Evelyn Carter, known for her civil rights activism in previous decades, stood up and spoke in a loud and clear voice. "I have lived long enough to see empty promises and false reforms. But what I see in this movement is something different, something real. And I'm not going to sit idly by while those who want to maintain the status quo try to stop us," Evelyn declared, receiving thunderous applause from the audience. Evelyn's words resonated in the community. She was a figure of respect, and her public support became a symbol of the legitimacy of the movement that Derek and his team were leading. On the day of the press conference, Derek, Maria, Gina, and other community leaders stood in front of microphones as cameras rolled. The tension was palpable, and anticipation grew as the crowd gathered to hear what was to be revealed. Derek began with a brief summary of the progress made, highlighting school curricula, reforms in police training, and the creation of new avenues of dialogue between the community and the authorities. But then he changed his tone and looked directly at the audience. "We have worked hard to build a fairer future for our city, but that future is being threatened by those who fear losing their power and influence," he said, pulling out the documents Gina had provided him. "These documents show how certain powerful figures have been funding and coordinating efforts to discredit our reforms and divide the community." Derek proceeded to detail the names and connections of those involved, including Arthur Collins and retired Sergeant Tom Barrett. The revelation provoked a mix of reactions from those present: surprise, outrage, and in some, a sense of relief that the truth was coming to light. Meanwhile, inside the police station, Lieutenant Miller was having her own battle. He decided to confront Sergeant Barrett directly, calling him to a private meeting in his office. She knew she had to be cautious, but she also knew it was time to act. "Barrett, I've received reports that some officers are manipulating the records to discredit the reforms. I know you're behind this, and I want you to know that I won't tolerate it," Miller charged, in a firm, unwavering tone. Barrett, for the first time, seemed surprised and lost for a moment, but quickly tried to regain his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about, Lieutenant," he replied coldly. Miller watched him, evaluating his every word and gesture. She knew Barrett wouldn't give in easily, but she was prepared to take disciplinary action if necessary. Outside, the press conference was coming to an end, and Derek addressed the crowd for the last time. He called for unity and resistance in the face of threats, reminding them that real change always faces obstacles, but that the key was to stay united. As the crowd applauded, Derek felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "I knew that the most difficult was yet to come, but I also knew that they had taken a decisive step towards truth and justice." That night, in his office, Derek reflected on everything that had happened. Although they had unmasked some of their opponents, he knew that the fight was far from over. Now that they had revealed the secrets and shown the community's commitment, their next mission was to consolidate the reforms and protect those who had joined the cause. Derek prepared for what was to come, with the determination of a leader who has seen the dark path of injustice, and has decided to illuminate it with the truth and commitment of his people. He knew that real change required sacrifice, courage, and the unwavering will to stand firm, even when times grew darker. And while the city faced an uncertain future, Derek was sure of one thing. Together, they were building something much bigger than just a movement. They were forging a new history for everyone. In the days following the press conference, reactions in the city were intense. The revelation of the names and connections of the saboteurs had provoked a groundswell of outrage, and also support for the reforms. News of the conference spread quickly, and social media erupted with messages of support for the movement led by Derek Stone. However, the actions of the opponents were not long in coming. Some influential media outlets, allies of Arthur Collins, began to spread a narrative accusing Derek and his team of acting out of political ambition and orchestrating a smear campaign against respectable citizens. Despite the strong evidence, the saboteurs were trying to undermine confidence in the movement through a disinformation war. Derek, aware of the seriousness of the situation, met with Gina Harper and other independent journalists to plan a media counteroffensive. The key was to present the facts clearly and forcefully, dismantling the lies before they could take root. They agreed to organize a series of in-depth interviews and articles, with testimonies from community leaders, reformist officials, and citizens benefiting from the changes. Meanwhile, at the police station, the situation was becoming increasingly tense. Lieutenant Laura Miller had decided to directly confront those officers suspected of tampering with internal records and sabotage. During an internal meeting, Miller brought to the attention of the group of veteran officers, led by Sergeant Barrett. "We are at a critical point, gentlemen, and I want to make something very clear. Any attempt to manipulate the records or compromise the integrity of these reforms will be treated as a betrayal of this department and the community," said Miller, his firm and confident voice. Sergeant Barrett, uncomfortable under Miller's gaze, just nodded without saying anything. However, his expression suggested that he was not willing to give in easily. On the other hand, the young officer Stevens had continued to gather information to help Miller, revealing that some officers were in direct contact with businessmen like Collins, who offered them incentives to act against the reforms. Stevens, increasingly committed to change, became a pillar for Miller and a key liaison with younger officers. In the midst of all this, Derek decided to intensify his outreach work with the young people of the city. Jaden Clark had launched the creative workshops, and the results had been promising. Young people from different neighborhoods were beginning to get involved, creating music, art, and poetry that reflected their experiences and vision of a more just future. Derek attended one of the workshops, where a group of teenagers were performing a short play they had created to express their frustrations and hopes. At the end, a young woman named Kendra Harris approached Derek shyly, but with eyes full of determination. "Mr. Stone, I would like to thank you for all that you are doing. I never thought anyone would hear our voices. I always believed we were invisible, but now I feel like we have an opportunity to change things," Kendra said, with excitement in her voice. Derek was touched by her words and smiled warmly at her. "Kendra, your voice is powerful, and as long as we all keep working together, there will be nothing stopping us. Keep expressing yourself and sharing your truth. It's more important than you think." The connection with the youth and the community began to further strengthen the movement, giving everyone a sense of belonging and purpose. However, Derek knew that there were still latent threats and that his opponents would not be easily stopped. In the weeks that followed, Miller's internal investigations led to the temporary suspension of Sergeant Barrett and 2 other officers, who had been accused of falsifying reports. This decision caused a stir within the department, with some veteran officers quietly but clearly expressing their dissent. Miller was aware that his position as a lieutenant was at stake, but he stood his ground, determined not to give in to the pressure. On the other hand, the media campaign launched by Derek and his team began to show results. Detailed articles and well-researched interviews helped reverse the opposition's narrative. In one of the most watched interviews, Evelyn Carter, the elderly activist, spoke eloquently about her years of struggle and how she saw real change in this movement. "In my years of activism, I've seen many leaders pledge heaven and earth, but very few delivered. Derek Stone and his team are delivering, and that is why they have my support and that of the entire community," Evelyn declared, her words full of strength and conviction. Opponents began to lose ground, and the community, motivated by the testimonies of respected figures, continued to mobilize to support the reforms. However, in the midst of these achievements, Derek received a disturbing message. Someone had left an anonymous note in his mailbox, warning him that the saboteurs were preparing a last move to destroy the movement for good. Derek, aware that he couldn't take this lightly, decided to beef up his team's security and alert Lieutenant Miller to the situation. "Laura, I received a warning about a possible coordinated attack. I don't know what they're planning, but we have to be prepared," Derek told him during a private meeting at the station. Miller nodded, his expression grave. "I know, Derek. Barrett has been in contact with influential people since his suspension. I can't prove it yet, but I think they're trying to orchestrate something to discredit you and the whole movement." Both knew that the next few days would be critical. The atmosphere in the city was full of tension, but also of hope. The battle for the future was at its most decisive, and resistance to change became more desperate as they lost ground. With his team more united than ever, and with the community increasingly engaged, Derek prepared to face the last round of his opponents. I knew the challenges would be enormous, but I also knew there was something even bigger at stake: the fate of a city that had decided to fight for justice and truth, and the chance to inspire many more. And so, with each passing day, the movement led by Derek Stone moved forward, despite threats and obstacles, with the conviction that justice and real change were not only possible, but inevitable. As tensions dissipated and the city began to adjust to the changes, Derek Stone paused for a moment to look at the place where it had all begun, the streets full of life, the voices of the community now united, and the faces of young people like Kendra, who once felt invisible and today led a new chapter of hope. They had faced threats, resistance, and sacrifices, but what was once a movement driven by the need for justice was now a transformed community, with citizens willing to protect the principles they had fought for. Derek knew that the fight for justice never ended, but watching people come together with conviction and courage, he felt that, for the first time in a long time, they were building a truly new and lasting future. With a heart full of gratitude and looking forward, Derek understood that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than he had ever imagined.